I'm liking the fact that we're talking about xenophobia in South Africa with Edwin kitted out with authentic South African colors and print. Hi, everybody. Welcome to this week's Professional Tribes, where we decided to get a little bit controversial this week and talk about xenophobia in South Africa. Now, I think the South Africans amongst you must know that we come in peace. We are looking to unpack an issue that clearly is real. However you might choose to dress it up, perhaps, is where the differences might lie. But for the various people that have been affected to varied extents by these, the social unrest, these violent attacks, they would stand there and say that the Kwerekwere syndrome has been the root of a lot of turmoil in their personal lives. So we thought, as people go to seek economic empowerment, go in search of work to foreign lands, South Africa being a choice jurisdiction amongst Africans who can't perhaps, or who choose not to go to the West and elsewhere, let's talk about it. So, as we do, we've got a tribe of incredibly fantastic human beings who are quite vocal on this subject. And if they haven't naturally been vocal, they are vocal naturally. I speak to one person in particular as I say this. I've never spoken about xenophobia with Derek before, but let's hear what he's going to have to say. I would like our panel to please introduce themselves to our audience. I will start with our lady, Wanisai, please. Wanisai, please say hi to our audience. Let them know a little bit about yourself.
Hi, my name is Wanisai Chigwendere. I am a screenwriter. I'm also, I like to think of myself as a cultural entrepreneur. I have set up 2 startups, and really the core, the DNA of what it is that I like to do is just to provoke a little bit of cultural excitement. I like people to be more culturally aware, especially as a Zimbabwean, then as an African. So this is a good place for me to be. I won't go. You will hear me. Later
we
on.
will. I'm sure we will.
It's okay. That's good enough for now. Yeah.
Looking forward to it. Let's move across. Let's start with the Zimbabweans. Let's go across to Edwin, please.
Hi there. I'm Edwin Bomani. I'm a fiber optic engineer. I've had the privilege to work pretty much all over the world and have done some work in South Africa and West Africa and in the Caribbean islands. I'm also a farmer. That's my passion. And I'm an African first, then a Zimbabwean second. That's how I like to view myself. And I think I have a lot of input in terms of what we're talking about now, because we do have some experience living in South Africa ourselves. So that part of it is also quite personal to us, because we've experienced the negative aspects of being a foreigner in South Africa. So that's my take on it.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Edwin. I'm going to save Tsepo for last because he's the one who's flying the South African flag in some shape or form today. So let's go across to Derek next, please.
Thank you, Mucha. I'm Derek Ashong. I'm originally from Accra, Ghana, so I'm representing the West Side over here. I am an entrepreneur. My history has been in the intersection of entertainment and technology, really looking at ways in which you can amplify African voices. I have a number of thoughts on this issue, but as Mucha will attest, I have a number of thoughts on all issues. So it's going to be no problem in sharing that, but that is a little bit of background and insight on me. And the one thing I will say to give some context to where I'm coming from is I think that it is a specific moment, historical moment, where Africa is not only central to our lives, but will be central to the future of the entire planet. And that it is incumbent upon us to seize that moment and recognize the value that we all bring to the table before other parties wind up being the primary beneficiaries while we are busy squabbling amongst ourselves. And so I approach this from a Pan-African perspective. Very much resonated with what you said, Edwin. An African first, indeed.
Amazing. And last but not least, Tsepo, would you please say hi to our audience?
Thank you so much for the opportunity, and good evening to everyone. My name is Tsepo Matsiwa. I run a reputation advisory firm specialize in nation branding and reputation management for individuals and corporations. We currently do work here in Africa, but also in Asia. So I think this will be an interesting conversation. And perhaps there's also an opportunity to just, before we even go, I'm also an African first, before I become South African. And maybe there's an opportunity also first to just clarify that the discussion about xenophobia is a sensitive one, and so we are going to engage. But also importantly, that we recognize that before we label an entity or a country or environment as racist or xenophobic, we have to just talk a little bit about the context so that we don't misguide the conversation. Because I think the essence of the conversation is holistic beyond the discussion about perceptions as to whether South Africa or South Africans are xenophobic or not.
Thank you very much, Sipho. Now, for our audience, we do like to know where you're joining us from, so please do let us know. Let us know your initial thoughts about this conversation. Is this something that you feel needs to be talked about more? Is it something that we should just accept as life? Is it something that you feel quite strongly about? Just give us a sense of how you feel about this subject matter. Quite with you, Sipho, on the idea that, you know, we could never label a country anything, because you always have entities within any institution, any organization, any country that have varied views on issues. I do believe, though, that it's a little bit, I need to be very careful today, because I don't want to come across as having made a judgment already. I genuinely am interested to hear what the views are from either people who've lived in South Africa, who've experienced any form of racism, any form of xenophobia, or have actually got a view that says it didn't touch me. And is that because of their social standing? Is that because they happen to live in the right neighborhoods? We don't know, but I would like to unpack all of that. So context is everything, right? As Sipho quite rightly says. And I think, you know, we can all say that we are African before we're anything, as much as we're human before we're any nationality or from any part of the world. The label xenophobia for South Africa, from the highest of offices in SA, has been sometimes rejected. The idea is that there may be some anti-foreign sentiment, which I guess is a bit of a softer explanation for what has happened over the last few years. Quick yes or no from everyone around the table. Is your view that we label it xenophobia?
I mean, if it quacks like a xenophobe, then it sounds like xenophobia to me. That part seems relatively straightforward from my perspective.
Okay, on a side?
I think I have to agree. I would remove the emphasis from, you know, labeling a nation to labeling behavior. When you are found sort of systematically, you know, accusing certain pockets, and they are all foreign nationals, of, you know, stealing jobs and, you know, stealing women and stealing whatsoever else it may be, it's problematic, because crime is not exclusively Zimbabwean. There's crime all around the world. So for you to have an issue with Zimbabwean criminals smacks of xenophobia. So I think the behavior and the attitudes, yeah, there is such a thing as xenophobia, and that is it. So I wouldn't put you.
Sipho, thank you. Thank you on the side. Sipho, so you're all about sort of getting reputation right and getting labeling right. What's your view on this particular issue?
Yeah, so I think South Africa, over a period of time, has had incidents of xenophobia, what you could label explicitly as xenophobia. But in recent times, I think there's been a generic labeling of every criminal incident that takes place in South Africa, either conducted by a South African, a Nigerian, or a Zimbabwean, or a Mozambican. All of that has been lumped together as xenophobia. Whenever South Africa reacts to issues. Now, I want to, and that's why I want to distinguish between a lot of things, distinguish between activities that are xenophobic related, criminal activities that are conducted by different type of criminals that are here in South Africa on a day-to-day basis, and then also a legitimate protests by South Africans who say, but in this context, we are being done under, and not because people are stealing jobs, but because foreign companies are actually choosing to consistently undermine locals and actually employ the cheapest labor possible, people who are willing to take the lowest possible fees for different types of work. And unfortunately, that impacts the lower level of the market, where you find the poorest of the poor, where you find people who may have had some basic education, but are battling with extreme poverty and difficult socioeconomic situations on a daily basis in South African townships. And so I think that distinction is very important, especially given the reality that South Africa faces today, not yesterday, today, an extreme level of migration from different parts of Southern Africa. And maybe at some point later on, we can debate how we lobby the region, the regional leaders. And I'm not just talking about government, but regional leaders in business and civil society holistically to discuss how do we get to the next steps. But for now, I think let's distinguish between the reality and the perception.
Right. So Edwin's got this intense look on his face, this distinction between reality and perception. What's your take on this?
Well, this is quite a nuanced conversation, I think, and I agree with all of the panelists. I think what we need to identify first is the behavior, like everybody's been saying, instead of denigrating it to just an act. So what I'm trying to say is, a lot of the things that happen in terms of violence are not necessarily xenophobic, but they have an element of economic structure to them. And so just calling everything xenophobic is a bit tricky, especially when we're talking about the South African climate. So I wouldn't just go out and say everything is xenophobic. That's the only difference here with me, is not everything is all about the xenophobic label, but the act itself needs to be called what it is. And in a lot of cases, we do see xenophobia. But then, like my brothers before me just said, that not everything is xenophobia. I think we got to be very careful when we talk about these issues. So that's my take on it. Okay.
So I'm seeing one side is ready to bust out with something. Let's hear it.
No, it's very simple. I agree 100%. But if we've been invited to have a discussion around xenophobia, then what we want to do is we want to identify the things that are associated with xenophobia, and it's not about anything else. So I do understand, as Edwin has very rightly pointed out, and it is extremely important, because the thing is, when you get feedback in the press, and very often things are lumped together, it is important to make that distinction. But I think it's also important to, when we've been invited to a platform like this, to call a spade, because we've been invited to discuss xenophobia, not all of the other things that are not xenophobia. So for me, it's that simple. And in trying to find solutions, in trying to understand the root, I think that's when you come down to all of the various nuances, the socio-economic, political, all of those other factors. But I think that if you're able to nip it in the bud and say, ultimately, this is xenophobia, then yeah, we've addressed that. And I think it's important to do that.
Sure. And for sake of clarity, I am literally talking about townships where people go in looking for Kwerekweres, wanting to establish their legitimacy in South Africa, and then punishing them for not either being South African or for the various reasons that we will unpack as we go on, i.e. taking jobs, stealing our women, leaving us impoverished, squeezing us out of the small pool of resources that are available. This is where the focus of tonight's conversation would lie. And I think we've had various examples, just as recent as a couple of weeks ago, there would have been some quite violent attacks that led to loss of life, 2019, 2015, 2013. There are various points in the history of South Africa where we've seen this particular labeling applied, and that's where I'd like to focus our attentions tonight. Derek.
Yeah, thank you, Mucha, and that's very well stated. I think there's a couple of things at play. Like, we are all well aware that violence is an issue in many societies. South Africa is struggling with it on a day-to-day basis that is not necessarily tied to these xenophobic attacks that we're talking about right now. At the same time, as Mucha just pointed out, it seems like there's this cyclical experience where people from outside are targeted, and it doesn't help us to find solution if we can't name the problem. Further, this is not limited to just South Africa. This happens all around the world. And one of the tricky things, you know, as a non-South African, I can't speak to the core political dynamics on the ground, but I can say that in many cultures, the people who come in seeking opportunity are leveraged for political purposes by some people on the ground who want to, you know, for whatever reason, give a scapegoat for other issues that might be endemic to the society. So for example, it is very likely that a migrant will be willing to work for less. But why? Because they're seeking an economic opportunity that's not present where they are. Is it really going to raise the wages of the domestic or the local person if the migrant wasn't there? If that market says that they'll bear a particular wage and somebody's willing to do it, then that's the job that's going to get played. I'll give you a simple example. You could tell from the accent, I spent years working in the United States, and we hear all up and down the wazoo about Mexicans and immigrants in South America, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then you're looking at the jobs that these people wind up doing, and you're saying, is the average American going to want that job at that rate? And if that Mexican person wasn't there, would that job then go to an American for a higher price? I think those same economic dynamics playing out in Europe. We saw it playing out previously in the EU, where I think Eastern European immigrants were sidelined for many years. Now we've seen it playing out with immigrants from North Africa, from the Middle East, Syria. Somehow Ukrainians are getting a better welcome. For now, we'll see how that plays out as it stops getting popular to be open-minded in this particular case. When it comes to South Africa, I'm like, is it truly so different from the common dynamic where people are lacking in basic and fundamental resources, and others who come in are scapegoated for the systemic issues that were already endemic to the society? And I feel like that is more likely, you know, what's at play than there's some inherent animosity between South Africans and other Africans. I think that we have to look at, that's why I'm not going to say I'm adamant about it, but I'm very clear about xenophobia is a thing. And the roots and the responsibilities in addressing it are not necessarily the same as generalized crime and violence. There's something going on that leads South Africa down this consistent path of demonizing other Africans. And it's a problem that should be addressed directly.
Absolutely. And you know what? I'd really like to do a very quick exercise. I do these random things on professional tribes. If you were to categorize, maybe just go around the fireside and talk about the one thing that you feel is justified by South Africans as the cause for their attacks on Kwerekweres. So, Tsepo, what do you hear, the rhetoric, be it rhetoric or fact, what do you feel is the main driver for these attacks?
Yeah, I think we're missing the point. So the first concern with the tone and language on the forum right now is you hear things like they're stealing our women. You know, reducing South Africa to that kind of a mindset is actually...
But we see this, Tsepo, we see this.
But it's actually embarrassing because that's not the South Africa that I live in, at least.
Right.
Where I am right now. So that's what you pick up in a tabloid, pick up on one or two social media platforms. But it's risky to generalize and create this picture that South Africans are actually walking around with no kirisi, looking for foreign nationals to kill or looking for Zimbabweans to kill. I work with a Zimbabwean in my business every single day. There are many Africans actually who come to South Africa legally, and they use the legal instruments and they get professional jobs, they start businesses, they register the businesses, they pay taxation, and they contribute to the economy. And there's nothing wrong with that. Where South Africans begin to have a problem is where you have the entire hospitality industry. If a foreigner comes to visit in SA, go to any premium restaurant in St. Johannesburg, and ask the person on the other side who's serving you, where do they come from? They generally come from Zimbabwe or one other state, and they're welcoming you to South Africa. It's a great experience, kumbaya. And that's where the problems begin, because there's also this narrative that, oh no, South Africa, just like the US or the UK, maybe these jobs are too special, and therefore there's no one here who would actually be open to take up this type of opportunities. But in fact, in South Africa, there are individuals who are sitting waiting for those kind of opportunities. So when you see the frustration in the narrative, don't take it for granted that, of course, it's just a bunch of politicians sitting under a tree with a bunch of lions and making all this sort of a dreamland type of exercise. I think there are systematic issues that we can't ignore. And that doesn't actually mean that South Africa or South Africans have the automatic right to violate others. So in South Africa, we have a constitution. That constitution protects everyone who is here, whether they are here legally or illegally. But you and I know that you can't go to Nigeria today and set up a business without any paperwork, walk into the country, set up a business, not participate in the economy in a legal fashion and survive for a while. But here in South Africa, there's a plethora of those kind of businesses. And not just, by the way, someone might think we're talking about Zimbabwe, but we may take it further. There's a lot of folks here from Pakistan, from Somalia, and different places who run illegal businesses, who sell actually poisoned food to children, who actually, there are a lot of guys from Nigeria who run drug cartels in the country. How they arrived here, I can't account for that. But what I wanted to correct is the narrative that, well, this is about strange things like they're stealing our women, stealing a job there, and stealing a job there. I think there are systemic economical difficulties. The influx is just unsustainable, and the influx of, and it makes it difficult to deal with the crime, which is a serious issue, because when someone is killed in Diepsloot and we pick up a South African, we're able to put them in jail because we know who they are and we can trace where they come from. This guy is unknown, and there's X amount of them we don't know. We don't count unknown people. We count people who have some kind of a documentation. And so that's the difficulty, I think, communication speaking and perceptions wise, that we've got to just try to make a distinction between the perceived, I understand what xenophobia is. That's not the debate in our world in terms of the socio-economic issues, that the pressure that is placed by the proliferation of undocumented foreign nationals. There's a practical example of a hospital in Limpopo where 80% of women who gave birth at a particular month were all foreign nationals, most of them undocumented. Now the pressure in the era that we're in right now, and given the reality of COVID-19, really makes it impossible for South Africans mentally to consume this and say, oh, this makes sense.
That's simple. Has a South African tried to go to this Limpopo hospital and been turned away because it's at capacity with Zimbabweans?
Absolutely. Actually, there's a practical, that's why I use that practical example, because a lady went to a hospital and was turned away because there was just, if you walk around our hospitals, you'll see the population. There's just no space for everyone. But this woman had to give birth actually in a public place. I think it was a train station or a bus station or something along those lines. They were able to get assistance. But that's just an extreme example that I'm putting forward so that we have a very constructive conversation, coordinated conversation.
We will have a robust conversation, I can assure you. I think some of these more frivolous examples are, you go onto YouTube and you will hear a South African guy saying they're taking our women. Right, my accent isn't very good, but you hear this sort of rhetoric. So it goes from the more mundane, more frivolous issues to the deeper seated ones. Edwin, I can see that you're quite intense right now. Let's hear what you're thinking.
Okay, so I just want to touch on what Tsepo was talking about. So a lot of the stuff that we're talking about when we're talking about xenophobia are the actual acts of violence towards a specific group, right? This is what we're trying to talk about. And this is what I was trying to say at the beginning, is that when we start using all these other different examples, it kind of takes away from the actual thing that we're trying to say, the act of xenophobia, when people are killing, maiming, and hurting people based on the fact that they're from somewhere else. Right. And I think a lot of all of this has to do with how not just South Africans, but Africans in general have been almost brainwashed to believe that the other is at fault. And this is where the issue really is for me as a Pan-Africanist, is that a lot of what we know as tribalism and even the whole thing with apartheid, when we say that apartheid is over, I don't think it ever really ended. And this is where we need to go down to the real core of the matter and talk about what it is that causes the xenophobia and why people are doing these kind of, well, acts, really. Because it's not just about, oh, they're taking our jobs. It goes deeper to the actual level of these people are not us, therefore we can treat them this way. And I think this is what, in my view, is the issue, is that we need to start educating one another as to what xenophobia stands for and nip it in the bud, rather than, if we start talking about the hospitals and these people came and did this and all the other things, it kind of takes away from the conversation. This is what I was trying to say, and I don't think I articulated it well enough.
Okay.
Because, yeah.
Let's talk about the act. Let's talk about the psychology behind a violent reaction to socioeconomic pressures. One aside, what are your thoughts on this? What do you think is the mindset that will drive people to go and put a tie around someone and light them up because they're a Kwerekwere?
It's interesting that you started there, because to connect it to what Edwin said, the history of apartheid, I believe that's called necklacing. It's interesting because I had a conversation with somebody a couple of days ago about this, and as usual, I was all hot under the collar and I was just, not holding back. And I was like, for me, it's like justifying lynching. I want to go back to what my brother Tsepo was talking about, the relation to the hospitals, and the very important distinction that Edwin made is that when you go into depth explaining socioeconomic conditions and what it is that people are experiencing in terms of not being able to access resources that they feel and actually do have rights to. But then the flip side is you take somebody out of their house, you burn them, and then you say, well, it's not frivolous, it's not about you taking our men, but you've just burnt somebody to death. You can't stop me from using a frivolous example like you're taking our men and then say, oh, it's because the hospitals were full. You can't burn a person. You can't burn a person in the street for any of these reasons. So this is the issue that we're talking about. We're talking about the acts of xenophobia. We're not talking about the root causes. We know that they are there, but the fact that society has broken down to a point where people are expressing themselves in this manner is what we are disturbed by. This is my issue.
Yeah. Can I also pipe in on that? Because I think what the whole issue, I think for most of us as Africans, is we have been trained so well to hate one another that it always kind of acts out in these really negative ways. And this part of it, the xenophobia, is the extreme. And that's what we need to start talking about really seriously, because if we don't start talking about these things will get worse and worse and worse. And there's no going about it in a polite manner. Xenophobia is xenophobia, and we've got to deal with it as xenophobia, because too many people want to hide and use different types of language and say, well, this happened, so therefore we can. But like Bonisai was saying, how do you get to a point of hating someone so much that you can pick up a rock and smash it on their head? Do you see what I'm saying? There's levels to it, but this particular act for me is way out of order, and we've got to address it as it is, what it is, the act itself. And I think that's what I was trying to say.
Yeah, sure. And this is really powerful stuff. Derek, before you jump in, I'd like maybe Tsepo to give some thoughts. I may well keep referring to you because I know that you're on the ground and you kind of talk about this day to day. But, you know, something that strikes me is for all the efforts to come up with national action plans, for instance, to combat racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerances in South Africa. I think there was a plan that was set up in 2019 along those lines. What is it that's preventing the message from getting through? Is it just rhetoric? That person on the ground who's carrying out these violent, and this is what, you know, to say, let's call a spade a spade. For me, there is no justification. I'm sure Hitler felt justified for what he did to the Jews. Anybody can put a narrative to justify any kind of behaviors. Extreme as that might sound, I'm quite keen to understand what it is about that psychology that says, I'm well within my rights to do this because. But before we address that, Derek, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a couple of thoughts. For one, I can see, you know, in fairness, why South Africans might be sensitive to this conversation because many challenges the nation is facing, and you're trying to say like, hey, there are real issues that are facing the average South African that they're struggling with, and it is not helped when you're having a lack of resources and additional pressure on the society by outside parties trying to also benefit themselves, trying to improve upon their lives. So I get the impetus that I think I hear from Tsepo to say like, look, don't lump all South Africans into this box and don't negate the fact that there may be underlying dynamics that are real and substantive. You know, I think at the same time, Edwin has brought up something that is very important, and Wanisa also touched on it as well, which is that the history of apartheid in South Africa dehumanizes everybody. Once you can say that some people are inherently better, some people are inherently less, and you're going to codify that into the social order, then you have put in place the fundamental building blocks of undermining the humanity of anybody and everyone. I think this is a big part of the root of the violence in the society. And I think it's a big part of why when people feel some kind of way about outsiders, the response can be so very extreme. And I feel like part of the concern, you know, I was looking to set up an office in Johannesburg. I was thinking about Johannesburg and Cape Town. And if you guys will indulge me, I remember getting off a plane, having flown from Accra to LA to do a couple meetings, and from LA to Joburg, and I'm like exhausted. I get off the plane, not been watching the news. The Uber driver's like, yo, I'm so sorry, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, what's going on? Next, to go to my meetings, come back to the airport, Mo, I'm so sorry, and Uber, what's going on? And then I see all these text messages from my family members, and they're like, yo, September 2019 or August 2019, xenophobic attacks against Nigerians. And my family members are like, hey, Nana, you know these people, they don't know the difference between Ghanaians and Nigerians. So be careful. And literally, I had to be like, oh, wow. Now I'm thinking about setting up an office here. I'm going between Joburg and Cape Town. And it had come down to, from 9 cities, we narrowed it down to 3. Joburg, Cape Town, and Mauritius for this particular project. We picked Mauritius because I can't expect any of my teammates to come in as Africans and to be unsafe. And what if something happened to them? And if we got to fly in for work and fly out, then so be it. So what I'm trying to get at is, I understand what I think Tsepo was saying is that, look, there are fundamental issues that are leading towards this kind of dynamics. But I think that one of those fundamental issues is exactly what Edwin and Wanisa are touching on, which is there's something that is in South African history and present that makes it easier to dehumanize people. You don't see people getting tired in Ghana. And not to say that we're the best, but
you know, Derek, it's selective because you're not getting an Australian facing these sorts of issues. You're not getting a Chinese person being attacked.
Absolutely.
So there is that selective.
Because apartheid says that Africans are less. And that's why when you talk to some South Africans, they're like, no, I'm not African, I'm South African. I'm like, Charlie, you have Africa and you're on the country name. There's like 2 of you that do that. How?
Sure. Several, quite a lot there, and I really don't want you to be the voice of South Africa on this panel, so I'm being quite conscious of that. But as you say,
and I'll try not to be the voice of South Africa, as in the spokesperson of South Africa. But
sure.
The essence. So we can't. So earlier on, I was listening carefully, and I like where the discussion is going. So we can't talk about, but this is xenophobia. Don't use practical examples when you talk about the cause, because the root cause of xenophobia is may well be that there are, and we're all trying to understand it, that there are certain economic conditions that create space for criminals to take certain actions against others. For example, I talk to the media regularly, and I talk to South Africans regularly from different spaces, and I say that we can't antagonize our partners from the SADC region as a start. We also can't antagonize Africans as a start, because that's where the economic activity begins before we go anywhere else. Unfortunately, of course, even a person that looks like myself as an African, you can't tell at a particular point whether I look like a Nigerian, Kenyan, or South African, or Zimbabwean. In fact, most of the time when I travel out of the country, people think I'm actually from Lagos. And so the potential of harm is there for all of us. The economic harm is of acts of anti-foreign sentiment, maybe let's call that, are actually impactful on all countries in the Southern Hemisphere. All countries that are trading with South Africa, but even countries that are trading outside amongst one another. It actually also makes it difficult for South Africans to have to rationalize their presence in other countries and be antagonized as a result in those countries, because of course we know that we don't operate on an island. But there are practical realities here in SA where extreme violence is conducted by undocumented foreign nationals. They may not be from Zimbabwe. There was an incident that took place, and unfortunately I have to use examples because we have been using examples. So let's go there. There was an incident where someone's head, in the process of illegal mining, someone's head was chopped off by what verbally sounds like, as they were speaking, and as you look at the dress code, they sound like residents or citizens of Lesotho. They sound like Basotho. They chopped off a head and they were kicking this head around. And there's evidence of that. And there are processes that are underway to figure out who those people are and where we can find them. But if you are undocumented, it's very, very difficult to trace. So firstly, we know that South Africa needs to deal with its own immigration laws, but additionally, South Africa needs to deal with the enforcement of those laws so that the border control is managed. At the moment, it's just a free flow and creates serious pressure. Unfortunately, the people who get punished or who are in the crossfire in the middle of this war are actually Africans, black, but often black South Africans and black or Africans, if I may say that. So no one condones the violence that we're seeing. No one is actually saying that Elvis's life. I mean, most of us, from the president of the country to business to civil society, I mean, we are all shocked and we are embarrassed and are very, what you call it, at pain about what happened to Elvis. But if we're going to go into that mindset alone, we're going to get a situation where South Africans whip out 50,000, X amount of people who have died because some undocumented foreign nationals were firing shots at them in the township, and some undocumented foreigners were doing illegal activity, and so on and so on. And so the solution is not to debate which violence was more extreme than the other one, because violence is violence and painful. And it pains us that we are actually compromising this specific region's economic prospects by having to deal with this type of behavior.
Yeah.
But at the core of this is because Zimbabwe does nothing about coordinating this movement between South Africa and Zimbabwe. You will get a bus full of undocumented people but that bus was let through on the other side to cross over, and led through by the officials of the specific country. And it happens in other parts of SADC. And so we face that pressing problem. And now to ignore those and just refer this to the psyche of apartheid because people were being lynched in those days, it actually can be problematic because there are people who used to conduct those acts. Some of them are no longer alive. In fact, the people who are conducting the acts today are younger people. It's a different generation that was never actually grew up under apartheid. They've never experienced apartheid. But the pressures and the difficulties of life are at play, but also additionally, the extreme levels of crime that we're seeing, I think are not necessarily to do only with the psyche of a nation, but they have to do with also opportunistic criminals who have nothing else to do. And I think the law enforcement of this country, they've let us down, and they let us down from time to time. And I think that's a serious debate that we need to have. To protect every person who is on the shores of our country, illegally here or not.
So, Tsepo, I do get a little bit concerned about the labeling of undocumented people as almost being the seed of all South African ills, because I think it's very easy to shift in that direction or to justify a lot of behaviors, right? You've got illegal immigrants all over the world. This is not a peculiar issue. Go to the UK. Rwanda has now taken it upon itself to become a conduit for these people. One does beg the question, just go onto YouTube and listen to interviews that have been conducted in some townships with South African youth, and you hear things like, Mina, I can't work for 50 Rand a week. That's below me. Give me a real salary and I may just start working, being the essence here. We touched on this earlier on, that immigrant who's coming from absolutely desperate situations or is an asylum seeker or for what a refugee or whatever it might be, is willing to work for that amount of money because guess what? It's a livelihood for them. So I would really like to kind of unpack this idea that is there a mentality perhaps amongst a certain section of South African society that says, I'm not going to touch this kind of work because it's beneath me. I'm not going to accept low wages. And if I do get employment, this I hear from a lot of my friends who hire domestic help from everywhere else in Africa, except South Africans, where there is this belief that actually, the people who are willing to work are the rest of the Africans. Our South African low earners are really quite problematic. Is that a fair assumption? And maybe, Edwin, you've lived in South Africa. What would your take be on some of these thoughts?
Well, I just want to address Tsepo there, just ask a question. It's not all countries in Southern Hemisphere, though, that are burning people. Do you know what I mean? When we look at the essence of what we're talking about here, we don't hear about people burning people except in South Africa. So we've got to address this. We can't just ignore it and say, oh, well, because there's an influx of foreigners from Zimbabwe or from Zambia or from wherever. This issue is specific to what we're talking about. This is why I said the act itself needs to be addressed. And then you've got people, over 50 people were attacked, right? 50 people were attacked because of who they were, because they were Zimbabweans. So when we start to try and nitpick and say, oh, because it was immigration and this, immigration happens all over the world, guys. It's everywhere. I haven't been to a single place in the world where immigration doesn't exist, but it's only in South Africa where you're denigrated for being a Zimbabwean, where you're actually targeted for being a Zimbabwean. We were there in South Africa for over a year. We lived there. And people can actually point you out in a crowd that that's a Zimbabwean. They know us. And that is a problem within itself, because how do we as neighbors all of a sudden decide that these certain people, these certain Africans are the ones that we need to target? And I think that's an issue we have to completely get a hold of and talk about. Because if we keep skirting around it and talk about, oh, well, immigration and this and that, we lose sight of what's happening here, because It's Zimbabweans that are being targeted. It's Nigerians that are being targeted. It's Ugandans that are being targeted. It's specific sects of people. So that's one thing that I want to just point out straight away.
Mm. And Edwin, so just to jump in quickly before you move on to your next point, if you're going to do that, is I do think it's, if we had a psychologist or behavioral therapist on, they'll probably tell you that people typically pick on the most vulnerable in society. So I think it's easy to conclude that the reason these things happen to immigrants in certain parts or townships is because they're just easy pickings. And if you are indeed undocumented, so if I actually do hear your point on undocumented, how do you go and report a crime if you can't prove who you are, if the first thing that you're asked for is your ID when you go to a police station? I don't know if it works that way in South Africa, but certainly where I am, before you even start a conversation with law enforcement, you're needing to give your ID. So it's these sorts of things that perhaps prevent people from reporting and just make them that much more vulnerable.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's a difficult one to deal with. So we don't, I mean, the question of people dying in a barbaric fashion that we see, that extreme level of violence, is not one that represents South Africa as a whole. And it's not something that we are actually celebrating. And I don't think on the whole, you know, you have, that's why I was trying to say that we should minimize the historical perception creation issue that here now a bunch of people who walk around with weapons looking for Zimbabweans every hour, or looking for Botswana, or looking for that or other nation. But in the same way, we know because we are here that Hillbrow, for example, is overpopulated with criminals, and most of them are from Nigeria. And similarly, the drug capital now of South Africa is becoming Durban Central and Sunnyside in Pretoria. And those things are not from this country. We don't manufacture those kind of things here. And we know from investigations and people who've been arrested numerous times where those problems come from. And that's a serious pressing issue. Can we ignore that and say, and you know, it's neither here nor there, it's quite another? Is it psychological? I would leave that to psychologists to do. But what I would ask is maybe we need to start asking, what are the Africans in the diaspora doing to speak to their own leaders so that they can actually create an environment where, especially particularly in SADC, because I'm talking about SADC because I'm talking about the challenges that we're facing here now. And so, because I'm not a psychologist and I'm not going to debate the psychology of xenophobia, except to say that it is an embarrassing act of crime, just like racism is not something that any country or any individual wants to experience or be associated with. And so South Africa constantly, I think regularly, I mean, as I say, we make an effort to deal with any signs, as we deal with any other social ills, any signs of xenophobia. But to dismiss a range of protests against acts of violence or against an overpopulated environment where people are actually using everything possible to undermine the authority and sovereignty of a country, to dismiss that as some psychological hullabaloo, it would be problematic, I think. And that's why you're going to experience tension when actually we could have a conversation. And I think there's a discussion here missing about where are the leaders of these countries so that they can create a path for their citizens to also, those who are not documented, to have a path to go back and get themselves in order and sorted, so that we can actually have more constructive conversations about how do we then create an economy that can sustain all of us.
This sounds like a big deflection, Seppo. It sounds like a huge deflection of the issue.
No, but hang on. But the notion,
no other government can justify or remediate somebody putting a tie around somebody's neck and burning them. I'm also curious about what proportion of crime in South Africa is committed by outsiders as opposed to by South Africans. It sounds like a big deflection, which will not lead to a substantive conversation on the issue.
The problem here is that you want us to sit in this room and say, let us dismiss everything that South Africa is concerned about.
Not at all.
South Africa is experiencing. And then create a frame and a picture that here's a bunch of people walking around with knobkieries looking for people who look like Tsepo so they can chop their heads off and bend them. And I'm saying that at some point we need to deal with the systemic issues that lead us to where we are. Ignoring those issues simply means that we are polishing a problem instead of dealing actually with the essence of the challenge. And that essence is not just psychological.
If I may, respectfully, I don't think that anyone is making the case that there are just these crazed gangs out there hunting for immigrants. But we do know that South Africa has a greater incidence of violence against migrants than any of the other countries in the SADC region. Why? And I think that deflecting against that core issue of why in South Africa does it get to such extremes cannot lead to a solution.
Can I interject very, very quickly, just because it's on that point? I also wanted just to raise something with my brother Tsepo, and I feel for you. You're in such a sensitive position because we do understand from the depths of our heart, we do understand where you're coming from. We do understand all of the layers upon layers of issues. Zimbabwe is in tatters, and maybe that's what makes it even more painful, is that when people are so desperate for employment, people are so desperate to make a living. You go to South Africa and you're a gardener because you just want to feed your family. We get that that's a problem, we get that that's a problem. But I think it makes it all the more painful because it's the most vulnerable of your African brothers and sisters who are being treated in this way that they can't expect to be treated anywhere else in the world, but in South Africa. That's problematic. But just to say something, I want to raise a point. When you start talking about criminality and foreigners bringing criminal behavior into South Africa has had a history of, South Africa used to be the crime capital of the world. In the 80s and 90s, South Africa's had such huge problems, okay? Johannesburg, Cape Town, with crime. So to suddenly, just because we're now in 2020, 2001, to suddenly say that all of these foreigners have brought in, drugs, this, that, and the next thing is just inaccurate. It's just inaccurate. Another thing is, other countries in the world, we've had people, being sent back on planes, coming from England with the Shangan bags. It was well known. Other countries, you commit a crime, they will find out where you're from. They will put you on a bus. They will send you back. It's called process, and it's not something that should be causing, because that gap in process between South Africans feeling let down by a system and then this extreme criminal behavior, all of these things that we're trying to address, and which I understand you may not necessarily have the tools, but just to be able to acknowledge our frustration in saying there is this gap. And we understand, I can take ownership for Zimbabwe and say, yeah, there's probably way too many of us, there right now. I get it. But we also can't ignore that there are these gaps that need to be addressed. And we can't ignore the violence. We can't ignore the violence that is so much easier to commit against Black brothers and sisters than it is to address the actual problems at hand. That's a burden for me.
Sure. And what I'm getting from a lot of what we're discussing is really almost needing to find someone to blame for these behaviors. So on the one hand, we're saying that the weight of this sits with undocumented immigrants. On the other hand, one might pose the question, what is law enforcement doing? What are the policymakers doing to try and curb these behaviors at the point that we actually recognize that it is xenophobia and we don't try to dress it up as something less toxic, less sinister? I think that then enables people to make policies and at least start to have policy discussions that actually move the dial somewhat. So let's touch on, and I'm conscious that in this, we've spent so much time debating the fundamentals, which I think is really important. Let's move on to policy, then let's move on to solutions. What would it take to change this narrative round?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have to go if I may. There are 52 member states of the African Union. and you need to start there to ask these questions about how do we address, because as I say, and it's going to be difficult for me to say anything else that's not factual from my experience, because I'm here. And I think we are here. So the 5 member states of the African Union need to talk about how do we create sustainable economies in every region, including the SADC region.
The Africa Continental Free Trade Area, there's your solution. So they're coming up with policies, they're coming up with a model that's designed to do exactly that. That's designed to drive integration across the continent.
Yeah, but you're not going to do that when the leaders themselves of all these countries are not having the real conversations that you and I are having right now and taking ownership about those. So in South Africa, for example, I've already lamented the fact that, and I emphasized it a few times, the fact that law enforcement has been a serious challenge, which makes it easier for this type of things to happen and to continue to happen, because there's a responsibility to protect every single person, irrespective of who they are, in line with our constitution. So that's very clear. But I think there's space for business. We know that the African Free Continental Area is there. Our president was immediate past chairperson of the African Union. So we're paying attention to that discussion. But there's a responsibility on the leaders themselves in each region to do something about the problems that we're facing economically, because at the heart of all this is not hatred alone for the other person, because if we reduce everything to that alone, I think we won't get to the core. The core of this is the struggle for survival, the means to access economic activity and feed families. And the reality here is that a lot of this discussion is not taking place at the right level on a regular basis. I think some of the structures that we have in every region of the continent, I've looked at the Pan-African Parliament, some of these structures serve to create an impression that we're busy solving problems, but they actually don't deal with the core issues that people are facing on a day-to-day basis, and they don't translate into most of the time tangible work. And so in the end, you end up with this a picture that we have that's very dark and makes us all very sad and unhappy. But and then of course there's a huge gap that was left a while ago. Thabo Mbeki was talking about the African Renaissance. And so what is the promise of Africa, and who is driving that promise, so that we all aspire towards that purpose? And that issue is lacking, with the exception of the fact that if you are interested in these issues, you will know about Agenda 2063 of the African Union, the Africa we want. But actually there's no vision and inspiration for Africa, so that we can all rally towards that vision. And that's a leadership challenge. And that's why I'm saying maybe this conversation should be taken up with the key structures of the African Union and each of the regional bodies, to at least try and do something. At least here in SA, we can share this with the leadership of SADC.
Sure.
Very close. Yeah.
Sure. Derek?
I mean, I think that I see it from a different perspective. I think that it's more fundamental and it's much more localized. I think that South Africa has not invested effectively enough in its own people. I think that corruption within the government and local business has made it harder for South Africans to realize the full potential of the nation across the society. So in a way, I agree with something that Seppo was saying earlier, which is that the average South African is like, hey, where's my opportunity? Now there can be arguments about why somebody coming in from Zim or Mozambique or wherever might be willing to do more or work for less or what have you. But I think that there is a legitimate concern about the lack of access and opportunity for low-income South Africans, and specifically Black South Africans. That has to be addressed at the local level. Now, I think that there is another element to it, which is, let's say that you get everybody better educated, you start to, nice up the opportunities, the economy starts growing, then more people are going to want to come from other places, unless we also have the kind of conversation that Seppo was getting at, on the regional basis about what other governments are also doing to clean their house. You know, at the end of the day, this to me comes down to something very fundamental that we talk about across the continent, when we're not even, you know, just Ghanaians speaking to Ghanaians or talking to a Nigerian or talking to somebody in other parts of the territory, which is that we have the youngest population on the planet per capita, and we have the oldest leadership. And there's a massive gap between what that leadership is willing to do for the people and what the people need in order to strive and thrive. And I think that, you know, as my last statement, I do think it must be considered what is required for young South Africans to find their own way. Otherwise, it will be so easy to scapegoat other people.
And, you know, I'm loving that you've touched on that, Derek, because I think, again, when you start to think about the dynamic in South Africa and with other African nationals coming through, that entrepreneurial spirit isn't always visible, I think, in the lower income segments of society. So you've got these immigrants coming through, they're setting up thrift shops, they're setting up, you know, handy shop, handiwear, and whatever it might be, car, auto stores, etc. I think a lot of what comes across perhaps as envy, or what drives some of these xenophobic reactions, may well be this idea that this guy came and he's only been here for a year and he's already got an empire down the road in, you know, Soweto, wherever it might be. Do you see the need for perhaps some of this policy to address, and, you know, it matches very nicely with what you're saying, Derek, around young populations, old leadership, because if you don't understand what drives innovation, if you don't understand what Rwanda might be doing or what the tech industry can offer you to keep them engaged, then you're completely missing the boat, completely missing a trick there. Not everybody was meant to stand in front of, you know, on a microphone and be a singer. There's a lot more that our youth can offer the economy, which perhaps we're not quite capturing adequately. Want to say?
So first of all, I was going to sort of support what Derek was saying earlier, that I think that there's, it's complicated because this is such a nuanced discussion, but then it's also very, very important to compartmentalize problems, because it's just like, oh, well, there's an, you know, issue with leadership. Well, there is an issue with leadership, absolutely, definitely. But is that a solution to this particular problem that we're discussing today? So when you talk about policy in the context of xenophobia, and I don't know if that then extends to immigration as well. Are we including that, or are we just talking about policy in that regard? So for me, I think that there is room. I hate to say this on camera. I'm at a point where looking to government and leadership response to certain things is sort of like just barking up the wrong tree. I think that civil communities need to start to mobilize better and more to respond to some of these things. My mind goes to the civil rights movement in the United States, that there were laws, you know, around segregation that were keeping people out of certain places. It then became necessary when you look at the, you know, the Farrakhan's and the Martin Luther King's, all of these people who were driving civil action on the ground, they had to come outside of the system to build almost like micro economies outside of the system. And this is how they were empowered. This is how they got their voices. Right now, we've been doing this for decades. You know, in South Africa, it's getting worse as we watch. And I hate to be negative, but I feel as though you talked about the entrepreneurial spirit. The more we start to look away from government and build ourselves up in terms of civil society, and then perhaps we'll get to a point where government is forced to listen to us, and perhaps then we can start affecting policy from another direction. I'm not...
So a vigilante who's been out in Hillbrow or elsewhere would tell you that this is their response to exactly what you're prescribing, right? So we're organizing ourselves, the civil society, and addressing an issue that nobody else is giving a look into.
The difference is that that's not a structure, that's not a system. You can't hope to go and set fire to every, you know, problematic immigrant. that's not a system. What I'm talking about, when you look at what was going on, like I gave the very specific example of civil rights in the United States, but you then had things like Black Wall Street, you had people coming together in civil society, developing their own structures outside of, and this is when I say outside, I'm not talking about mafia. There has to be a difference. Legitimate structures and movements of people who are able to operate. Because, like I said, for me, waiting for the government, you can do those things. Those things tend to take a very, very long time. But I think it's also time that the citizenry just became better empowered to deal with problems that are on the ground. That's my take.
Okay.
My very unorthodox take. That's my take.
We respect all opinions. Let's say opinions.
I would like to agree with what I say about social responsibility, but at the same time, we can't make significant change without government. And I think this is where Derek was alluding to, that there cannot be one without the other. And the only way it can actually work is to get a younger generation to start running our governments. Because with the older generation, we're seeing it over and over and over again. And if we can't look at history and learn from it, what are we doing really? Because this is almost like living on a wheel, like the hamsters on a wheel. This is what is happening in Africa at the moment, is that we keep regurgitating the same type of leader over and over and over again, and we're not seeing any different results. Yes, we have to have individual responsibility, as in terms of we need to start amongst ourselves, getting together and begin to make structures that make it conducive to force these kind of legislative arguments that we're talking about, because governments will only cede to power. That's the reality. There's no government that's going to listen to anybody who hasn't got anything to say. And we've got to work in tandem with both of these. That's the only way it's going to work. So as business people, unfortunately, what's going to happen now is South Africa, if it carries on going down this route, because it does have this bad reputation of crime, and more people are going to be shy away from it because of these kind of things like xenophobia. Like my brother Derek was just saying there, that he chose another place completely because of this. And there's many other people that I know who have gone down that route and decided not to use South Africa as a port of business because of these certain issues. So for us to completely run away from them, we've got to attack this in both spheres, both individual responsibility and find a way of governance that works for the younger generation, because the older generation are not doing that for us. And that's my take.
And here's the thing, right? So the World Bank releases an inequality report for the Southern African region, and South Africa is always ranking way up there. We all know that there's typically a correlation between education and some of these skewed ideologies. And I do think you can't work independently of a government system to address some of these fundamental issues, right? Because you need, unless we're saying that civil society is now setting up schools and educating people in Kailicha or wherever, there needs to be that collaboration, I think, between government and civil society. And one then begs the question, how can you organize that in a meaningful way that actually drives and delivers lasting change? And this becomes the conundrum, really. Who takes ownership of some of these actions?
Just to answer, because I put that forward. You're absolutely right, it has to be in tandem, but Edwin said the exact right thing, that government only cedes to power. We have seen, we marched in November 2017, we marched and we got a president who was 10 years younger than the one that had just been marched out. So we are aware that governments need to be younger, but how do we do this? It's not something that is actually in our power. So the only thing that we can do with the resources that we actually have right now, with who we are on the ground right now, is to be empowering ourselves so that at the opportune moment, we're going to be able to meet our governments and have a voice that can actually be heard to implement these things that are necessary for us to move forward. Otherwise, like everyone has just said, we're just going to keep on going round and round and round like this and not making any progress at all. Because, yeah, that's just, that's our unfortunate reality. And the most practical thing to me, the most doable thing is for us to keep on having discussions like this amongst, and building up our societies, our business communities, and being more conscious of the impact that we can actually make, and not just sort of being about each for himself, but having a more community orientated.
And what's interesting, I want to say, is when I hear you say this, as a continent, we really do value oral tradition as a means of passing history down, but I don't think we value conversation like this enough. And part of the impetus behind setting up platforms such as Professional Tribes really is to bring conversations to the fore and to make it commonplace for people who perhaps we don't have access to parliaments and spaces where decisions are made. But surely if you get enough people listening, opining on stuff like this, you can start to draw the right attention to the right subject matters. So long may these conversations continue, I would say. I think we are over our hour, and I know that my panelist is late in some parts of the world that we're in. So just as a parting shot, so there's so much more that we could have unpacked today. What's evident to me is that the need to almost accept, a bit like in an AA, I've never been to an Alcoholics Anonymous session, just for the record, but you start by admitting that you have an issue. And without that initial admission, you can't really move forward. I think that psychology applies to absolutely any wrongdoing, any ill in society, any ill within the individual. So parting shot from our tribe tonight. For anybody who is watching this, who may be considering seeking their fortunes abroad and looking for a rosier life elsewhere, I think beyond the perception, there are sometimes some really darker issues that one needs to contemplate. Let's go around the Pamocha and just touch on considerations perhaps for that young, impressionable person who on either side of the equation, actually, I'm formulating this question as I speak because my mind is firing in all sorts of directions. But on the one hand, for that disempowered or youth that feels disempowered, who feels that their economic opportunities are being taken away from foreigners in South Africa, a bit of word of advice from the panel, or that person who feels that they're better off going somewhere where perhaps they may not be as welcome. What do we want parents to consider? What do we want youth to consider? What should people be thinking of on this topic more broadly? Let's start. I know that was a bit convoluted, but I think you get the essence of what I'm driving at. Advice for our viewers who are thinking about life abroad. And I think most of us have worked in various markets, haven't we? So let's start with Edwin, because he seems ready with a response.
Well, I would say, especially in the African context, a lot of people tend to think that the grass is greener on the other side, and that's not necessarily true, especially if you do not have money where you are at. And this is the trap that a lot of young people tend to fall for, is that they think that the grass is going to be greener if they just go there. But that's not always the case. So my advice would be, in your place where you are, begin to develop yourself as an individual, because it starts with self-responsibility. And then when you start to look for economic opportunities around you, wherever you do end up going, if you do decide, you're already empowered to do something more than what somebody can take advantage of you for. So that's my take on it, is that having sons and having children, I know that this is always something that people tend to think is an easy out. And, oh, if I go to that country, it's going to be easier, but it's not. And we all know this. If we've all worked abroad and we've had to start from scratch, it's actually harder because you've got nowhere to start. So I would suggest empower yourself, educate yourself to a level where you are able to do something where you're at, so that when you leave, you're able to do that same thing where you're going. And that's my take.
Thank you. Very good. Thank you very much for that. Tsebo?
Yeah, look, South Africa is open for business. So I believe that there are opportunities here. There are serious opportunities for actually us Africans in the diaspora to do a homecoming and go back home and go and fix the mess that we're in currently. And for the younger ones who are here, let's work together to build this continent. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Thank you very much. Derek?
Yeah, I mean, I would echo a little bit of what Edwin said about people investing in themselves where they are. I do think that there's a, grass is always greener mentality that afflicts many of us. I will also say that there are a variety of dynamics that are currently happening on the continent that are fascinating. I see so many people from so many different parts of the world trying to figure out how they can do business in Africa. And what I would say is, before you get up and go from where you are, ask yourself, why are others trying to come in? Because I'll end where I began. We are at a very special moment, and we're at a moment where we can invest in each other, in our young people, having these kinds of substantive conversations, but also putting real capital and investment into our populations, and especially our young people. And for those young people, they need to invest in themselves, because if we're not careful, we will watch Africa taken out from under our feet again. And this is not the moment to make that mistake.
Love that. Thank you. Wanasai?
I will piggyback quite heavily on what Edwin said with regards to investing in self, but also with an emphasis on practicality. There is this sort of knee-jerk reaction coming from an African academic background, educational background, where it's sort of like, well, go and do law, or go and do this, or go to tertiary education. But you also talked about the entrepreneurial spirit earlier. And for young people, trying to find your space in that area, trying to find the practical out for yourself, a practical expression, so that you can actually, the Bible says, and we always say in Shona, find a way to work with your hands. So anything that can be practically implemented, whether it's the rabbits, whether it's the eggs, whether it's really, really basic things that people tend to look down on. But when you look at the situation that just happened, with Elvis in South Africa, and it was the simplest thing, it was gardening. So trying to find that practical base at whatever level you're at, whatever you have access to, is what I would be doing, and not necessarily looking too far ahead, but starting small. Is my 2 cents.
I love that. And you know what, in addressing these highly skewed distributions, I guess, of productive assets, we forget some of the basics, for the guy who thought to add the tip on shoelaces. Imagine how much he would have made from such a basic, simple idea. And I think, if I recall, as a kid, people were quite industrious. Kids would make cars out of coat hangers and make some really clever crafts with virtually anything and everything around them. So one does beg the question, perhaps living in a digital age, the allure might be in some of the more fancy, sophisticated sectors, but actually, like everyone here is saying, thinking about where you are, what you have at your disposal, and making it work for you is an absolutely powerful start. And then again, the idea of kind of setting out, leaving home without a plan is perhaps one of the biggest mistakes that anyone can make. So really knowing where you're going, why you're going there, and what it is you're looking to achieve once you get there may well save a life or two in the process. In the meanwhile, I don't think we could ever exhaust this conversation. Seppo, thank you so much for being the consummate gentleman, for obliging us with all our kind of thoughts around South Africa. By no means was this an attack, but as the South African on the panel, it goes without saying that you've had the lion's share of, I guess, educating people around the thoughts on this subject matter. Derek, you've been a star. Thank you so much for being on Professional Tribes. Always a pleasure to speak to you, to hear your insights. I think we should talk about the creative industries actually as a side discussion, and really just seeing how Africa positions itself for its future, because we need to tap into this youthful exuberance that we have and the skills that are quite natural to us. And I don't know that we do enough of that. Wanasai, keep talking. We appreciate you.
Thank you so much for having me.
No, it was an absolute pleasure. Edwin's videos vanished. I don't know if he's still on with us, but Edwin, thank you as well for your insights. It's been an absolute pleasure to have a Ghanaian, a South African, Zimbabweans on the platform today talking about xenophobia in South Africa and really the dynamics around that. Of course, we cannot talk to the psychology with any sort of educated lens because we are making very many assumptions here. But fact is, there are some egregious things happening in the region that do need to be addressed, and sometimes addressing them begins with a conversation. To our audience, you've been a star. I see your comments have been flying in. I would request that our panelists go back, maybe read through the thread and address some of the questions and comments that might have come through. In the meanwhile, our job is done for today. Thank you all so much for your attention and your time, and we will see you next time on Professional Tribes. Take care now.
Thank you.